Welcome to the Deep Dive, where the show that takes complex research really gets into the weeds and brings the core insight straight to you. Today, we're tackling something really fundamental. It's relevant if you're trying to learn anything new, recover function, or honestly just achieve any significant goal. We're diving deep into the neurobiology of how we change ourselves based on our source material titled Focus Attention and Neuroplasticity Achieves Goals. Now, look, we all kind of get that you need attention to learn, right? That seems obvious. But the argument here is much, much stronger. It's not just that attention is needed. The claim is that focused attention is the actual executive gate. It's what controls the when, the where, and crucially, the how your brain decides to make permanent changes to itself. We're exploring what the source calls the attentional plasticity continuum. Basically, the idea is that when you consciously decide to focus, you're not just, concentrating harder. You're actively tapping into these powerful brain chemicals. We'll talk a lot about dopamine to literally drive the physical changes, the new connections, the rewiring that you need for mastering a skill or even functional recovery.
Yeah, it's really fascinating because we're connecting two seemingly different levels here. You've got this high-level thing, this cognitive function of attention, of focus. And then you have the microscopic cellular stuff, neuroplasticity, the brain actually changing its own structure. So think of neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to adapt, right?
Right.
Think of it like a huge construction site in your head. Focused attention, that's the CEO. It's the one who says, okay, this project gets funding, releases the neurochemicals like dopamine is the budget,
Yeah.
and provides the blueprint for what needs to be built or reorganized.
So without that deliberate, focused command from the top.
Exactly. Without that focused executive input, sure, your neurons might be firing. There's activity, maybe random, maybe just reacting to stuff around you. But you don't necessarily get that lasting reorganization that's aimed at a specific goal you chose. This executive gate is so important because, well, changing your brain takes energy. It's biologically expensive. Focused attention is the signal that tells the whole system, hey, pay attention to this input, this activity. It's valuable. It matters. We need to make it permanent, whatever the cost.
Okay, so you've got the conscious intent, the high-level decision to focus, and then the physical result, the brain changing. Let's start with the machinery that allows for that intent, the attention system itself. Right, so when we say pay attention, often people think of just maybe listening quietly or watching something.
Hmm.
But the kind of focus needed for the permanent changes we're talking about, it sounds like it's much more active, more rigorous. The source calls it executive attention. What's the real difference between that and just, being awake and generally aware?
That's a great distinction. General vigilance, just being awake, that's pretty low level. Executive attention is way up the hierarchy. It's a sophisticated cognitive function. It's designed specifically for pursuing goals, especially when things are complicated or there are distractions. So it's not just about concentrating on the right thing. It's also about simultaneously, actively, and this takes effort, filtering out everything else that's competing for your mental space.
And that's not just like the dog barking outside.
Oh, no.
Oh.
It's external noise, sure, but it's also internal stuff. Your own thoughts wandering off, maybe worries, memories popping up, even other goals you have. Executive attention has to manage all of that. The source material actually calls it a system of top-down cognitive governance. It's like the brain's management system. And it involves a whole suite of complex functions. Things like planning ahead, figuring out the steps, sequencing, staying organized, setting the actual goal. But also, really importantly, constantly checking for errors, monitoring how you're doing. And then self-regulation, catching yourself when your mind drifts and pulling it back.
Pulling it back to the task.
Exactly. When you engage this whole top-down system, you're ensuring that you're not just superficially noticing the information, you're selectively encoding it. You're processing it deeply. And that deep processing is what prepares that information, that skill pattern, whatever it is, for being consolidated into long-term memory or structure.
That really clicks. If you're learning something complex, say a new piece on the piano, you're not just looking at the sheet music. You're planning the next few bars, you're listening for mistakes in your playing, you're trying to ignore the fact that you're hungry. That definitely sounds like it takes a lot of mental horsepower.
So where does the brain house this command center?
Well, the architecture for executive attention isn't in just one spot. It's pretty distributed. But the main hub, the real orchestrator, is undoubtedly the prefrontal cortex, or PFC, right at the front of your brain.
The PFC. That's the primary conductor. But it doesn't work alone. It has critical partners it collaborates with very closely. Key players include the anterior cingulate cortex, the ACC, also the anterior insula, and the striatum. Together, they form this really robust network. And this network's job is basically to maintain that state of focus and integrate the motivation you need to actually stick with the goal.
You mentioned the ACC, the anterior cingulate cortex. The source links it to conflict monitoring. That sounds a bit abstract. How does it help you stay focused?
Yeah, conflict monitoring is the term. Think of the ACC as like the brain's internal smoke detector or maybe a referee. It's not actually doing the action or holding the memory itself. Its job is to detect when things aren't quite right, when there's a mismatch or a conflict.
Like what kind of conflict?
For example, maybe the action you just took didn't produce the result you expected. That's a conflict. Or maybe two different pieces of information are competing for your attention at the same time. The ACC flags that. When it detects that conflict or that error, it sends out this strong signal, mainly to the PFC. It's basically shouting, hey, management, something's wrong here. We need to shift attention.
Ah, so it's like an early warning system for the PFC.
Precisely. This vigilance signal from the ACC allows the PFC, the executive, to then adjust the strategy, maybe increase the level of focus, or dedicate more resources to figuring out and fixing that error. So the ACC is absolutely vital for that self-correction loop, for maintaining the quality of focus you need over time to really learn something difficult.
That makes so much sense. Focus isn't a one-time thing. It's this constant process of monitoring, detecting errors, and correcting course until you get it right.
Exactly right. And we can see how advanced this system is by looking at how it develops over a lifetime. Developmental neuroscience gives us some really cool insights here. Attention systems mature in a kind of sequence, a hierarchy. Really basic stuff like processing visual information that comes online pretty early in childhood. Then you get more sophisticated abilities like focusing attention on specific locations in space or on particular objects. That matures a bit later. But the parts of the PFC that support this true executive attention, the really complex stuff like long-term planning, goal persistence, self-regulation, those are the very last to fully mature.
Really? How late are we talking?
Often not fully until the mid-20s, sometimes even later for some functions.
Wow. So the ability to really take charge of our own learning and change, that's fundamentally a feature of the mature brain.
Absolutely. The raw capacity for plasticity, for change, exists throughout life, that's true. But the ability to efficiently and deliberately direct that plasticity, to consciously drive structural change towards some complex, far-off goal, that depends heavily on having a fully functioning, mature PFC. When you, as an adult, decide, okay, I'm going to master this skill, you are literally using the most recently evolved part of your brain to reshape itself.
That really underscores why it requires serious mature effort.
It does. High-level goal attainment relies on that mature PFC function.
Okay, so we have the driver, executive attention, orchestrated by the PFC and its network. Now let's properly define the process it's driving, neuroplasticity. We hear the term a lot, but let's break down its major forms.
Right. Neuroplasticity, at its core, is just the brain's fundamental ability to change itself, to reorganize its connections, strengthen pathways, sometimes even grow new parts in response to experience, learning, or even injury. And yeah, it keeps happening throughout life, even in adulthood. It's not just a childhood thing. We can broadly divide it into two main types. First is structural plasticity. This is about the physical changes, the actual hardware modifications.
Like building new roads or adding lanes.
Exactly. This includes things like neurogenesis,
Mhm.
the birth of brand new neurons. Now, that's actually quite rare in the adult brain outside of a few specific areas, like the hippocampus, which is involved in memory. But much more common is synapogenesis. This is the formation of new connections, new synapses between existing neurons. It's like running new data cables between computers that are already there.
Okay, so that's structural new physical bits. Then you mentioned functional plasticity. That sounds more like changing how the existing hardware is used.
Precisely. Functional plasticity is about the brain reorganizing its workflow, how it uses the architecture it already has. Two key examples here. One is cortical remapping. This is where the map of your body or functions in the brain cortex can actually change size.
Change size? How?
Well, for instance, the area representing your fingers in the sensory cortex can literally expand if you take up playing the violin and practice intensely. More use means more dedicated brain real estate. It can also shrink with disuse.
Fascinating. And the other example of functional plasticity?
That's vicariation. This is a really profound type of reorganization.
Vicariation. Okay, tell us more about that one.
Vicariation typically happens after significant brain damage, like from a stroke or a traumatic brain injury. It's when a function that used to be handled by the damaged area gets moved to a completely different, undamaged part of the brain. So maybe an adjacent area or even the corresponding area in the opposite hemisphere might step up and take over that job.
So the brain is rerouting major functions.
Exactly. It's not just a small tweak. It's a major reallocation of computational resources. That undamaged area has to learn and dedicate itself to a task it wasn't originally built for. And crucially, this kind of large-scale functional reorganization doesn't just happen passively. It's driven by persistent, focused effort during rehabilitation. It's a direct result of that intentional drive we're talking about.
Okay, this is putting the pieces together. The PFC is the conductor running this advanced executive attention system. It needs to kick off these construction projects, structural plasticity, and reorganize workflows, functional plasticity. How does it send those instructions out? How does the intention to focus translate into the physical work order for change across the brain? What's the currency of change here?
Now we get to the crucial chemical signaling. This is where intent meets mechanism. You see, the PFC isn't just thinking abstract thoughts when you focus. That's sustained activity of its neurons, holding the goal in your working memory, keeping distractions out. That requires neurochemical fuel and specific messengers.
And you mentioned this top-down control the PFC exerts. It's not just sending a memo, it's actively managing things lower down.
Absolutely. It's pervasive and active modulation. Think about visual attention, for example. There's an area within the PFC network called the frontal eye field, or FEF.
Okay.
When you're really concentrating on searching for something visually or tracking a moving object, the neurons in your FEF are highly active. Now, this activity doesn't just help direct where your eyes move. It actively changes how neurons respond way back in your primary visual cortex, the part of the brain actually processing the raw visual input.
It changes how the visual cortex works.
Yes, it modulates their sensitivity. It's very similar to what happens during covert attention when you pay attention to something in your peripheral vision without actually looking directly at it. Imagine looking for your keys on a messy desk. Your PFC, via the FEF, is effectively telling your visual system, boost the signal for anything key-shaped or shiny, and dampen down the signal for everything else, the papers, the pens, the coffee cup.
So it's actively sculpting your sensory experience based on your current goal.
Exactly. The PFC is dynamically altering how your sensory systems perceive the world to prioritize goal-relevant information. It's really powerful top-down control.
Okay, that's a fantastic illustration. So the PFC is the planner, the controller. And to get its directives out to the construction crews, so to speak, it uses what the source calls a catecholamine bridge. This is the link between the cognitive intent and the cellular mechanism.
That's the perfect way to put it. This bridge is absolutely critical. It's built primarily from a class of neurotransmitters called monoamines, specifically dopamine, DA, and norepinephrine, NE.
Dopamine and norepinephrine, the catecholamines.
Right. These are the key regulatory molecules that span the gap. They do a few crucial things. They help synchronize the brain's overall state, they set the right level of arousal or alertness, and they provide the crucial reward and relevant signals needed to push neural activity past the threshold for triggering lasting physical change.
Let's focus on dopamine first. It gets talked about a lot, often just as the pleasure chemical, but its role here sounds much more sophisticated.
It really is. While it is involved in reward, its function in the PFC related to attention and plasticity is far more nuanced. It's arguably the pivotal modulator of the synaptic plasticity that's required for genuine, goal-directed learning and adaptation. But here's the really fascinating and slightly tricky part. How dopamine works in the PFC isn't just more is better. It follows what's called an inverted U dose-response curve.
An inverted U, like a hill. Okay, what does that mean in practice?
It means there's a sweet spot right at the peak of the curve. Optimal PFC function, strong focus, good working memory, cognitive flexibility that's achieved only at an intermediate level of dopamine signaling.
Only in the middle range.
Right. If you have too little dopamine signaling in the PFC, performance drops off. You might feel foggy, unmotivated, have trouble concentrating or planning. That's the left side of the U. But if you have too much dopamine signaling, performance also drops off. You might become overly rigid, perseverate on irrelevant details, or feel scattered and unable to filter distractions. That's the right side of the U.
So you need that Goldilocks amount just right. Wait, if it's that specific, doesn't that make focused attention quite fragile? Like, can things like stress or lack of sleep easily knock you off that optimal peak?
That's an excellent point, and yes, absolutely. It highlights the delicate nature of this top-down executive control. Maintaining that optimal dopamine level is metabolically demanding and sensitive to disruption. Stress is a big one. High stress can flood the PFC with too much dopamine and norepinephrine, pushing you over the peak and impairing executive functions. Lack of sleep can deplete neurotransmitters, potentially pushing you down the left side. Even just being bored or unmotivated can correspond to lower DA levels.
It's like tuning an old radio, isn't it? Too little signal, you get static. Too much signal, it's distorted and buzzing. You need that perfect spot in the middle for clarity.
That's a perfect analogy. And yes, achieving and sustaining that clear, persistent activity in the PFC, right at the top of that inverted U, is what robust focused attention is all about, neurochemically speaking. And crucially, maintaining that optimal state is precisely what signals to the rest of the brain that plasticity mechanisms should be engaged.
So focused attention isn't just willpower. It's about actively generating and maintaining the specific, balanced neurochemical state in your brain's executive center.
Exactly. And when the PFC is operating in that sweet spot with that ideal dopamine modulation, it does something critical. It effectively gates the induction of long-term change. It sends signals downstream, particularly to key learning centers like the striatum, involved in habit formation, and the hippocampus, involved in memory, basically saying, pay attention. The information being processed right now is highly relevant and important. Strengthen these pathways. Dopamine release in those target areas is essential for consolidating the memory or the motor pattern associated with that focused effort. It primes the system for LTT, long-term potentiation.
Okay, so dopamine fine-tunes the focus and gates the plasticity, but staying in that highly focused, vigilant state sounds tiring. That requires energy, alertness. That's where norepinephrine comes in.
Yes, norepinephrine, or NE, plays a vital complementary role. It mainly originates from a tiny structure deep in the brainstem called the locus coeruleus, or the LC. But despite its small size, the LC projects incredibly widely throughout the brain, with particularly dense connections to the PFC.
Sprays NE everywhere.
Pretty much. If dopamine is tuning the relevance and gating the plasticity, norepinephrine is more about managing the overall arousal and alertness level needed to sustain the effort. NE helps regulate vigilance, keeps you awake and oriented, and facilitates learning by ensuring the brain is in an optimal state to process incoming information. During focused effort, robust NE signaling from the LC essentially tells the PFC and other brain regions, maintain high alert. The energy expenditure required for this sustained focus is authorized and necessary. It synchronizes the brain for the task.
So without enough NE, your focus would just fizzle out.
It would likely wane much faster, yes. You'd struggle to maintain that high level of alertness, pushing you down the left side of that inverted U towards under-arousal and difficulty concentrating. You need both DA and NE working together optimally.
Okay, let's quickly map this out then. We've got the PFC acting as the main executive gate. It decides when to open for plasticity and what information gets prioritized using its top-down control.
Check. And it's funded, chemically speaking, by that optimal balance of dopamine and norepinephrine.
Then you mentioned the striatum. It's a major target for dopamine signals from the PFC system, and its role is key for, what again?
The striatum is crucial for learning through repetition, especially for forming habits and skills. It's where the brain gradually automates behaviors that start off requiring intense focus. So it's a prime location for plasticity driven by focused practice.
Right, the automation center. And finally, the anterior cingulate cortex, ACC, our conflict monitor.
Yep, the ACC keeps watch, making sure attention is allocated correctly. When it detects an error or conflict, it signals the PFC to adjust, driving that corrective, motivated repetition needed to refine the skill.
Wow. Okay, it really is a sophisticated, interconnected system. It seems perfectly designed to translate effortful focus into lasting structural change. So we've got the command structure, PFC, ACC, and the chemical messengers, D, A, and E. Now we need to get right down to the ground level. How does that perfectly balanced chemical signal actually cause a physical change? Right there at the synapse, the connection between two neurons.
All right, let's zoom into the cellular machinery. This is where activity-dependent plasticity happens. The whole basis of learning and memory rests on the ability of these connections, these synapses, to change their strength. And the main way they get stronger is through a process called long-term potentiation, or LTP.
LTP.
If there's a burst of high-frequency activity across a synapse, meaning the first neuron fires rapidly and causes the second neuron to fire repeatedly, that synapse can undergo changes that make it more sensitive, more efficient for a long time. The signal transmission gets easier, faster, stronger. It's like paving a dirt path. The traffic flows better afterwards. LTP is widely considered the primary cellular mechanism for how we learn and form memories, making connections stick.
Makes sense. But surely we also need a way to weaken connections that aren't useful, to prune things back.
Absolutely essential. That's the flip side. Long-term depression, or LTD. This is a long-lasting decrease in synaptic strength.
Hmm.
LTD is crucial for getting rid of noise, for clearing out connections that are irrelevant or maybe even incorrect for the skill you're trying to learn. It ensures the brain focuses its resources on the pathways that matter.
So the brain is constantly strengthening some paths and weakening others.
Exactly. And here's the key. Whether a specific synapse undergoes LTP, gets stronger, or LTD gets weaker, depends entirely on the pattern and timing of the electrical activity it experiences.
And that pattern is dictated by.
By what you're focusing on. Your focused attention and the resulting actions drive the specific patterns of neural firing that will determine which connections are strengthened and which are pruned.
Wait, this links back to that famous old saying in neuroscience, the Hebbian principle. Neurons that fire together wire together.
That's the classic formulation, yeah. Donald Hebb proposed that back in 1949, and it set the foundation. When one neuron repeatedly helps fire another, the connection between them strengthens. Modern neuroscience has refined this idea quite a bit, particularly with something called spike timing dependent plasticity, or STDP.
STDP, spike timing. So the timing is critical.
Incredibly critical down to the millisecond level. STDP shows that it's not just that neurons fire together, but the precise order and timing interval between their firing that determines the outcome. So if the first neuron, the input, presynaptic, fires consistently just milliseconds before the second neuron, the output, postsynaptic, fires, that connection tends to get stronger. That's LTP.
Cause and effect?
Kind of, yeah. The input predicts the output.
Right.
But if the order is reversed, if the input neuron fires consistently just after the output neuron has already fired, the connection tends to get weaker. That's LTD.
Wow, that precise. Milliseconds.
Yep. The typical window for STDP is very narrow, usually within tens of milliseconds. The relative timing is everything at that micro level.
Okay, but here's where I get a bit stuck conceptually. If these rules operate on a millisecond timescale, how does that explain learning that takes weeks, months, or even years? Like someone mastering chess, or learning a language, or recovering from a stroke. Those things happen over vastly longer timescales than milliseconds. How does the brain bridge that gap?
That is the crucial question, and it leads us to a really important concept: behavioral timescale plasticity, or BTSP.
Behavioral timescale plasticity. Okay.
The idea behind BTSP is that while the fundamental synaptic rules might operate on that fast timescale, the conditions required to trigger those changes and the window for associating events can be expanded much, much longer, potentially over hours or even days, especially during complex goal-directed behaviors.
So the window for firing together, wiring together gets stretched out. How does focus attention make that happen?
Think about what focused attention does. When you're deeply engaged in learning something complex, your PFC maintains that goal state, that optimal dopamine level, that heightened alertness with norepinephrine for the entire duration of that learning session, right?
Right, you're holding the context in mind.
Exactly. That sustained focus, orchestrated by the PFC, creates a kind of continuous cognitive context, or a learning APEC. It's like putting a special tag on all the neural activity that happens during that focus period. This sustained high-level state, driven by attention and modulated by those key neurochemicals like dopamine, essentially primes the relevant synapses. It keeps them eligible for modification over a longer period. It allows the brain to link neural events that might be separated by seconds, minutes, or even longer within that focused session, applying those Hebbian STDP rules across that extended behavioral timescale.
So the sustained focus acts like a temporal glue, sticking together moments of effort that might otherwise be too far apart for the basic millisecond rules to connect them.
That's a great way to think about it. The focused attention provides the necessary context and chemical environment to say, all the activity happening while this goal is active is related and should be considered for plastic changes.
Does this help explain why certain learning strategies work better than others, like spaced repetition versus cramming?
Oh, absolutely. BTSP provides a strong neurobiological rationale for spaced repetition. When you cram, you might generate a lot of activity in a short burst, but you likely don't sustain that optimal PSC state, that ideal dopamine modulation, long enough or effectively enough for really deep consolidation via BTSP.
You overwhelm the system.
Possibly. Or you just don't maintain the optimal chemical tagging state. But with spaced repetition, you repeatedly re-engage that focused, top-down attentional system. Each time you come back to the material after a break, you have to actively retrieve it, reestablish that focused cognitive context, regenerate that optimal neurochemical state. Each focus session reinforces that BTSP window, allowing the brain to link the learning across days. It's the repeated, focused re-engagement over time that accumulates the high-frequency activity needed within that extended time frame to really drive robust LTP and long-term retention.
So just passively reviewing isn't enough. It has to be active, focused retrieval and practice.
Precisely. Simple re-exposure likely isn't sufficient. You need that effortful, focused re-engagement to really leverage BTSP and trigger lasting change.
Okay. And when these focused, behaviorally timed synaptic changes, LTP and LTD, accumulate over time, millions and millions of them, that's when we start seeing bigger changes, right? Like the cortical remapping you mentioned.
Exactly. Those micro-level synaptic adjustments are the building blocks. When they accumulate in a coordinated way within specific circuits, they cascade upwards to produce macro-level changes. We see this very clearly in motor learning studies. The maps in the motor cortex literally change shape and size with dedicated practice. But here's a really critical insight from the source material, especially for anyone learning a physical skill. Simply repeating a movement mindlessly, without focus, doesn't do much.
Just going through the motions isn't enough.
Generally, no. Repetitive motor activity alone seems insufficient to drive significant functional reorganization or map expansion in the motor cortex. You might get some minor peripheral adaptation, but not that deep central change. What is required, according to the research, is motor skill acquisition, and that, by definition, involves focused attention. Usually also involves novelty you're trying to improve, solve a problem, reduce errors, and goal-directed practice.
So you have to be trying to get better.
Yes. That combination focus, novelty, goal direction is what generates the necessary type and pattern of neural activity sustained over time via BTSP to really drive significant representational plasticity, like seeing the hand area in the primary motor cortex, M1, actually get bigger and more refined.
The quality and intensity of the focus literally dictates the amount and the permanence of the physical change in your brain map.
You got it. That's the core message.
All right, we followed the path from intent in the PFC through the chemical signals like dopamine down to the cellular rules like LTP-LTD and the timing principles of STDP and BTSP. Let's now look at the end game, how all this focused effort leads to mastery and ultimately making skills automatic. So achieving real mastery in any complex skill, whether it's cognitive or motor, means developing adaptable patterns. You need to be flexible, adjust to different situations, and this, as we've established, requires that sustained, dedicated, focused effort. You need to integrate feedback, tweak your approach, constantly monitor for errors, all driven by that PFC-led executive attention system.
Absolutely. That initial learning phase is all about that effortful focused practice driving LTP and starting to sculpt those neural pathways. But, the brain's work isn't done just because you finished your practice session for the day. There's another absolutely critical phase for locking in those gains. We have to talk about sleep.
Right. Sleep isn't just downtime. The source material really emphasizes it as an active stage of consolidation, especially for skills. How does sleep help turn that focused effort into permanent ability?
It's fascinating. During certain stages of sleep, particularly deep non-REM sleep, the stage with those characteristic slow brain waves, the brain seems to go into an editing and refinement mode. It doesn't just passively store what you learned. It actively replays and reinforces the neural patterns associated with the skill or information you practiced while you were awake and focused.
It replays the activity.
In a way, yes. The neuronal ensembles that were active during learning show reactivation during sleep. This strengthens the key synaptic connections involved in that skill, solidifying the LTP. But it also does something else equally important. It engages in selective weakening or pruning. It seems to downscale connections that were maybe only transiently active or less relevant to the core skill, getting rid of the noise.
So it strengthens the signal and prunes the static.
Beautifully put. This process helps extract the essential information, the gist of the skill, or the core procedural knowledge, making the neural representation more efficient and robust.
Yeah.
You wake up, and often the skill feels smoother, more integrated.
So the quality of your focus during practice directly impacts the quality of consolidation during sleep.
It certainly seems that way. The brain reinforces what was strongly activated and tagged as important during wakefulness. If your focus was sharp, sleep has a clear signal to work with. If your practice was scattered or unfocused, the consolidation process might be less effective or could even reinforce suboptimal patterns.
That adds another layer of importance to really concentrating when you practice.
It really does.
Now, for many skills, the ultimate goal of all this intense focus, practice, and sleep consolidation is actually to reach a point where you don't need to focus so much anymore, to make it automatic. Let's talk about the neurobiology of habit formation.
Yes. the journey towards automaticity. This is where we see that remarkable shift of control within the brain circuitry. As we know, when you first learn something complex, driving a car, playing an instrument, coding, it's incredibly demanding. It's highly dependent on the PFC and its executive functions. It takes a ton of mental energy.
It's exhausting, yeah.
But with enough focused repetition over time, something amazing happens. Control for executing that skill or behavior gradually shifts away from the effortful, energy-guzzling PFC and towards more efficient, reflexive circuits located deeper in the brain, particularly in the striatum, which is part of the basal ganglia.
The control literally moves. How does that happen physically? Does the PFC just hand over the reins completely?
It's more like the PFC acts as the initial programmer and supervisor. During the learning phase, the PFC guides the activity patterns in the striatum. With repeated, focused practice, the connections within the striatum that represent that specific sequence of actions get strengthened, solidified through plasticity. Think of it like the PFC painstakingly writes a complex software routine and then installs it onto the striatum's hard drive. Once installed and debugged through practice, the striatum can run the routine much more automatically, needing less direct oversight from the PFC.
So the PFC might still initiate the action, but the striatum handles the execution.
Largely, yes. For well-learned habits and skills, the striatum can execute the sequence almost reflexively in response to the right cue, with minimal conscious effort or PFC involvement. The behavior becomes smooth, fast, and efficient. And often, the need for external reward diminishes too. The smooth execution itself becomes the outcome. This whole shift is central to what the source calls the energy efficiency hypothesis of goal attainment.
The energy efficiency hypothesis. Okay, let's unpack that. If focused attention is so vital for initiating change, why is the brain apparently in such a hurry to make it unnecessary once the skill is learned?
It comes down to resource management. The energy efficiency hypothesis suggests that the ultimate biological purpose of investing all that effort into focused attention is precisely to make itself redundant for that specific task.
Yeah.
Your brain, brilliant as it is also fundamentally geared towards conserving energy. Running that PFC-heavy executive control system is incredibly metabolically expensive. It burns a lot of glucose and oxygen.
Thinking hard is literally hard work for the brain.
It really is. So the brain has this drive to automate routines whenever possible. By shifting control of well-practiced skills to the more energy-efficient circuits in the striatum, it frees up the PFC. And what does the PFC do with that freed-up capacity? It can tackle new complex problems, learn new skills, deal with unexpected situations, or monitor for errors in other ongoing activities.
So automation buys you cognitive bandwidth.
Exactly. It's an evolutionary advantage. The better you are at focusing intensely now to build robust, automated habits, the more mental energy and flexibility you have available for future challenges and learning. Mastery is ultimately about achieving efficiency.
That's actually a powerful motivator. The hard work you put into focusing today pays off by literally freeing up your mental energy tomorrow.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It's an investment. But we have to acknowledge the downside of this incredibly powerful plasticity mechanism.
Ah, the dark side.
Yes, maladaptive plasticity.
Yeah.
Because the brain's mechanisms for change are fundamentally activity-dependent, they don't inherently know if the activity pattern you're driving with your focus is actually good or bad for you long-term.
So if you focus intensely on the wrong thing, the brain will diligently wire that in too.
Unfortunately, yes. If sustained, focused activity reinforces detrimental connections or inefficient patterns, the brain will strengthen those just as readily as beneficial ones.
What are some clear examples where this happens, where focus leads to problems?
The classic examples often come from motor control, leading to conditions called use-dependent dystonias. Think of writer's cramp, where the act of writing becomes distorted and painful, or focal hand dystonia in highly skilled musicians, like pianists or guitarists.
How does focus cause that?
Well, imagine a musician practicing incredibly intensely for hours every day, high levels of focus, high repetition. But maybe there's a subtle flaw in their technique, like excessive tension or an awkward hand position. Because the practice is so focused and repetitive, the brain diligently reinforces that flawed motor pattern through plasticity. It strengthens the wrong connections, sometimes leading to degradation of sensory maps in the cortex as well. The result is involuntary muscle contractions, loss of fine motor control. The brain has essentially hardwired an error because the input was focused, repetitive, but flawed.
Wow. That's a really stark illustration that focus itself is neutral. It just amplifies whatever signal it's directed at.
It really is a double-edged sword. The brain's amazing capacity to reorganize based on focused input can, if misdirected, lead to significant problems.
Mhm.
But even these negative examples reinforce the core principle. Focus is the primary agent driving the organization or disorganization of neural circuits. And importantly, the source material emphasizes that the treatment for many of these maladaptive conditions also relies on harnessing focused attention this time, to consciously and effortfully override those faulty patterns and retrain more functional ones. It takes deliberate, focused effort to undo the results of previous, perhaps misguided, focus.
Focus got you into the mess, and focus retraining is the way out. Okay, so this idea that focused attention is the key lever for driving plasticity, both good and bad, isn't just theoretical. It's being actively used in clinical therapies. Let's look constraint-induced movement therapy, CIMT. You mentioned it earlier in relation to stroke recovery.
Yes, CIMT is a fantastic real-world example of deliberately weaponizing focused attention to drive beneficial plasticity. It's a rehabilitation technique primarily used for people who've had a stroke and have weakness or paralysis on one side of their body, often leading to what's called learned non-use.
Learn non-use, meaning they just stop trying to use the affected limb.
Essentially, yes. After a stroke, using the affected arm or leg is difficult and frustrating. So patients naturally start relying heavily on their unaffected side for everything. It's an understandable compensatory strategy. But the problem is, this lack of use leads to further weakening, and crucially, the representation of that affected limb in the brain's motor cortex actually shrinks due to that disuse. That's maladaptive plasticity. CIMT aims to reverse this.
And it does this by forcing focus, right? It has two key components that seem non-negotiable.
Exactly. They directly target focus and intensity.
Yeah.
The first component is the restraint. Patients wear a mitt or a sling on their unaffected good arm for the vast majority of their waking hours, maybe 90% of the day.
Wow, that's intense. So they literally can't use their good arm easily.
Right. It removes the easy way out, the low-energy compensation. It creates this state of forced use, of necessity. It compels the patient to direct their attention and effort towards using the affected limb for daily tasks. The brain is essentially forced to engage those weakened pathways.
Okay, so that's the forced focus part. What's the second component?
The second is the intensive program. This isn't just occasional therapy. It involves high-volume, highly repetitive practice of functional tasks using the affected limb. We're talking potentially 6 hours a day, every day, for maybe 2 weeks.
6 hours a day? That's incredibly demanding.
It is, but that combination, the forced focus from the restraint, plus the sheer intensity and repetition of the practice that's designed to generate a massive amount of targeted neural activity.
Hmm.
Enough activity, sustained over time, to cross that threshold needed to trigger significant synaptic modification, LTP, and ultimately cortical remapping.
And what are the results? Does this brutal-sounding approach actually work better than standard therapy?
The results are often remarkably good, especially considering these are often chronic patients who haven't seen much progress with other methods. Research consistently shows that CIMT leads to significant and lasting improvements in motor function of the affected limb. And neuroimaging studies confirm the underlying mechanism. The area in the motor cortex representing that affected limb, which had shrunk due to learned non-use, actually expands again and becomes more active after successful CIMT. The brain physically reorganizes.
And compared to therapies that just encourage general use?
That's the key comparison. CIMT, with its enforced focus and high intensity, produces substantially greater and more durable functional gains than interventions that might involve similar exercises but lack the constraint, or therapies that simply involve instructing the patient to try to use the affected limb more in daily life, or lower intensity practice schedules.
So just wanting to use it or gentle encouragement isn't enough. You need that forced, intense, focused activity to really drive the plastic changes.
It seems so. You need to hit that critical threshold of sustained, high-frequency, attentionally gated neural activity to convince the brain to undertake a major rewiring project. CIMT basically creates an unavoidable crisis that forces the brain to allocate resources and rebuild.
That's incredibly powerful clinical validation of the principle.
Yeah.
Okay, let's look at another therapeutic angle that also highlights the importance of targeting the attention mechanism itself. Neurofeedback training, or NFT.
Ah, yes, neurofeedback. This is fascinating because it tries to give individuals direct, conscious control over their own brain activity patterns, including those related to attention. In a typical NFT setup for attention, you might have sensors monitoring your brainwaves, EEG. The system is set up to give you real-time feedback, maybe a sound or a visual display whenever your brain activity matches a target pattern associated with focus, like producing more of a certain frequency band, say beta waves.
So you get rewarded instantly for producing focused brainwaves.
Exactly. By getting that immediate rewarding feedback, you learn, often implicitly at first, how to volitionally generate that desired brain state. It's a form of operant conditioning for your own neural activity aimed at strengthening the circuits that support sustained attention. Now, the really interesting part, related back to our core theme, comes from studies highlighted in the source material that looked not just at general attention, but at complex skills requiring targeted attentional modulation, like understanding speech when there's background noise or really challenging tasks.
Speech and noise. Yeah, that's tough.
So, researchers compared different NFT training approaches for this. One group was trained simply to get the right answer, identify the word correctly. Their feedback was based on behavioral accuracy. Another group, however, was trained specifically to enhance the neural signature associated with successfully encoding the target speech against the noise. They got feedback based on how well their brainwaves synchronized with the rhythm of the speech they were supposed to be listening to. They were training the internal attentional strategy.
So one group trained the outcome, the other trained the underlying brain process. What happened?
The results were striking. The group that trained the neural strategy enhancing that internal attentional modulation, the brain's ability to lock onto the target signal, showed not only improved brain responses, but also significant improvements in performance that generalized to new, untrained speech and noise tasks and even different listening conditions.
The skill transferred.
Yes. But the group that trained purely for behavioral accuracy, just getting the right answer, didn't show nearly the same level of robust transferability. Their improvement was more tied to the specific training task.
Wow, that's a critical distinction. It means effective training isn't just about practicing the task itself. It's about practicing and strengthening the way your brain pays attention while doing the task.
Precisely. The key takeaway is that reinforcing the fundamental internal attentional strategy, the neural mechanism of focus itself, seems to be much more effective for building generalizable skills than just reinforcing the final behavioral output.
Yeah.
You have to train the engine, not just reward the car for reaching the destination.
Training the how of attention, not just the what of the task outcome. That has huge implications for learning and skill development in general. Hashtag outro for chars.
So, if we take a step back and look at the whole picture we painted today, this intricate loop really comes into focus, doesn't it? It starts with focused attention, actively wielded by the prefrontal cortex, acting as that crucial executive gate.
Right, the decision point.
That executive control then optimizes the brain's chemical soup, hitting that sweet spot on the dopamine inverted U-curve, getting the right level of norepinephrine arousal.
Which creates the necessary state to sustain the effort.
Exactly. And that sustained cognitive context allows behavioral timescale plasticity to operate, stretching the window for change, which in turn enables the fundamental cellular rules, LTP for strengthening, LTD for weakening, to diligently convert that focused, goal-directed neural activity into lasting structural modifications at the synapse.
Building the new pathways, pruning the old.
Precisely. And the end result of all that focused effort, repeated over time and consolidated by sleep, is often the automation of the skill, that shift of control from the demanding PFC to the efficient striatum.
Fulfilling that energy efficiency hypothesis, freeing up the PFC for the next challenge. It's a beautiful, logical, physical system.
It really is. It provides a concrete neurobiological explanation for why learning hard things feels hard, because it requires marshaling these specific energy-intensive neural resources, and why the quality and consistency of your focus is paramount.
So bringing it all home, what's the big takeaway for you, the listener, trying to achieve something challenging? It really seems to boil down to this. Your ability to reach complex, long-term goals, whether it's mastering a musical instrument, learning to code, recovering from an injury, becoming fluent in a language, it's directly tied to your capacity to consciously direct and sustain your focused attention. You need to sustain it long enough and with enough intensity to literally drive the physical rewiring of your brain circuits.
That's the essence of it, just passively going through the motions. Simple, mindless repetition. It's just not enough from a neurological standpoint. The activity needs to be focused, it needs to be goal-directed, you need to be actively trying to improve or solve a problem, and it needs to be intense enough to generate that high-frequency, chemically gated neural firing that pushes past the threshold for synaptic change.
Focus isn't just some vague concept or soft skill anymore. Based on this, it's the actual physical lever you pull to enact permanent change in your own brain.
Well said. And looking forward, this understanding opens up some really exciting possibilities. The source material suggests that future research is likely to delve much deeper into the precise timing and location of these key neuromodulators, like dopamine and norepinephrine, during different kinds of focused mental effort.
Trying to map out exactly when and where the go signal for plasticity is given.
Exactly. Understanding those spatiotemporal dynamics in detail could be revolutionary.
Which leads to the provocative final thought.
Indeed. If we could precisely map that dopamine inverted U-curve for specific tasks in individuals and understand its timing, could we potentially develop ways to optimize it?
Yeah.
Perhaps using non-invasive methods like precisely targeted brain stimulation or maybe even more sophisticated forms of neurofeedback.
Could we learn to fine-tune our own neurochemistry, moment by moment, to keep ourselves right at that peak of the inverted U, perfectly primed for learning and change?
Could deliberately optimizing that executive gait become a powerful strategy for accelerating skill acquisition, enhancing cognitive performance, or even boosting functional recovery beyond what we currently think is possible?
A fascinating and perhaps slightly unnerving possibility. Definitely something for you to mull over or maybe even explore further on your own.